Mage 40K, Episode 11. Move over, Horus. There's a new heresy in town. It felt like it had been years, and it had, but we had been commissioned by the God Emperor of mankind to fix the 40K universe. We had done our best to deal with, convert, subvert, or export all the various Xenos and Chaos forces around the galaxy. Admittedly, we hadn't gotten every corner of the galaxy, and a lot of our plans would take some time to see their full fruition, but a lot of progress had been made. That just left the Imperium itself to clean up. Our first target was that den of heresy, idol worship, and, what pissed us off most, blind doctrinal stupidity that was the Adeptus Mechanicus. We were about to invade Mars. We had plenty of travel time before we got there, which was convenient, as it allowed critical incompetence to make more mechanically themed, steampunky backup bodies so we would blend in better. Weeb offered to help when he wasn't busy learning to control Tyranids, but it was decided that his expertise was better for biological mutations and such. He did provide a modified shadow in the warp that gave us a bit of a cloaking field. During this time, Critical also managed to get his highest level of entropy magic, which means he was only a partial power before. Oi. We also collected some demons on our voyage, and everyone got a handful of magical critters to call their very own. That guy enhanced his with creepy dolls and things, just because. Competence insisted that the rubric marines that were pulled to our beacon were her new demons. We figured they might complain about that, but once we re-ensouled them and they got a look at the kinds of multiversal technology and lore she had access to, the colossal nerds gladly converted and swore eternal fealty. She also got a cease and desist letter from Zinch, coated in magical poisons and booby traps. We sent them all back with a note about parity and fair use, ending with the advice, "Get good, scrub." For his part, Welshie had been convinced by our last encounter of the power of cheese. So, to work towards a creation of a cheese god, under the motto, "Leave each place a little weirder than you found it," he sent his agents out into human societies to establish altars to unwise dairy usage. Taco Bell locations. He was cackling evilly until we pointed out that this was probably more nutritious, and certainly more flavorful, than anything most human hive dwellers have ever had. In fact, flavor was such a new thing that, when he introduced the McRib, there were riots on 7 planets. Then, when he took it away as a marketing ploy of artificial scarcity, no less than 3 planetary governors offered to give him their entire worlds if he would just bring it back. He was a little disappointed, but still felt it was a win, especially as our spirit mages confirmed the beginnings of some curdling in the warp. After a fairly smooth warp voyage, it helps to have a chaos god as a friend. We arrived in orbit over Mars with forged documents explaining our presence as visiting mid-ranking tourists from the Forge world where we had created the cult of the Emperor's left nut, the Forge of whatever the hell, founded by a very unoriginal explorator. We figured that dealing with the Fabricator General was going to have the greatest results. To get to him, we needed to get past his guards. To do that, we needed some sort of fancy technological offering or holy relic. Basically a bribe. We thought of just creating one, but we shuddered at the thought of the AdMech running around with something that actually functioned properly. Who knew what kind of damage they could do? So we looked around and found a small subcomplex of the Olympus Forge, where the local Saint Gearface was having a series of processions for his holy day. Or possibly days, it was a bit unclear. There were 4 major chapels to his works, scattered around the forge, each holding a sacred relic of unknown provenance and purpose. We figured if we could steal, them and figure out how they worked, smash them together with duct tape and magic, we could find our way in. We donned our face and body-obscuring red robes, complete with various metallic bits, pretended we were tech priests and Scutarii, and made our way to the planet in one of our ship's Thunderhawks. We borrowed a supply from our former Inquisition bosses when we left. Well, Competence didn't bother with much disguise, as she had metallic, Necron-based skin. We did convince her to strap on some various gubbins and shiny bits, so she didn't look quite as xenotechish, and thus a target for destruction or acquisition. Weeb was a chitinous, tyrannid human horror, but he covered himself in organic metal and threw some robes over it, so he looked like a fairly typical tech priest. Someone did question him once, but he started talking in a mechanical voice about the advantages and efficiencies as he scurried up the walls. The watching cogboy agreed, and asked for the number of his prosthetics guy. We did manage to talk him out of the servo squigs and round, bitey cherubs, which would probably stand out too much. Also, we made sure to forge noospheric identities and credentials, created with the help of our cult. So we arrived in a pretty solid disguise, at least if you didn't look too close. This was good, as while we walked through the various pedestrian plazas, we saw, along with the Tesla coils and decorative fountains of brown water, a number of walls of heretics, with posters and images of criminals from across the galaxy. 6 of the newest, most prominently displayed posters showed very familiar figures. Us, along with the captions, "Wanted, dead or not living," and "Wanted for consorting with Xenos, Chaos Corruption, Heresy of Technology, Heresy of the Warp, Heresy of Biology, Heresy of Physics, and General Weirdness." We couldn't deny the charges, but we had orders, and a permission slip. We made a point to ask for some framed copies once we had taken over this stupid, rusty planet. Plus, well, she surreptitiously drew mustaches on all of them just to be sure. We weren't worried, though, because we weren't really planning on playing nice. I mean, Weeb had landed with a shopping list that just said, Titan Legions. All of them. And the Knights. Also, Competence and Critical were comparing notes on how to kill a god dragon. And Bard, in a fit of nerd solidarity, had promised the newly reinsold Rubric Marines to bring them the libraries, which he assumed were on ultra sci-fi floppy disks somewhere. We headed towards the Western Chapel. A while later, we found a pair of cogwheel embossed doors leading into the complex. We entered with the rites of entry, said the prayers, lit the incense, genuflected a few times just for good luck, then stood there for 10 minutes as the 10-foot wide doors slid open with aching slowness. The Scutarii guarding the room on the other side noticed us, looked exasperatedly at the doors, as far as we could tell under all that metal, and shouted an offer to have some recaf ready by the time we got through. Before we could take him up on the offer, Weeb started chanting, while he reached up a mechadendrite to oil the door. Welshie handed him a smoking censer, provided by a replicator in his chest, and we put on a show while Competence, out of view, used matter magic to actually make the damn thing function. When the Scutarii seemed impressed and asked how we did that, Weeb replied that we were members of the Order of the Gateway, and had the blessing of the Omnissiah. The guard tried to pretend that he had heard of us before, and we let him, while Bard pulled out a piece of chalk and started marking an abstract gate sigil on the door. When the Scutarii got too close, Bard tried to chalk the same sigil on him, which was only met with minor annoyance, since this guy had clearly dealt with loony tech acolytes before. Any time he seemed about to get suspicious or ask unpleasant questions, Weeb started loudly praising the Omnissiah and genuflecting. The guard was nice enough to give us some maps to the local complex, and the city at large. Not anything particularly detailed, but enough not to get lost. He was probably trying to get rid of us, and we allowed him to succeed. Also, well, she gave him a taco as we left, converting more and more acolytes to his cheesy faith. There were a lot of corridors leading to various chambers and factory floors around the place, but our directions gave us a pretty clear route to the main shrine, since it was the central facet of the chapel. Just before we got there, we found ourselves in an antechamber guarded by a Scutari and a tech priest. When challenged on our business there, we said we were visitors from another forge world and wished to pay our respects to the Holy Saint Gearface. The priest said this was excellent, and all are welcome, so long as they had their properly signed and dated entry forms in chits. In triplicate. Did we have our papers? We didn't, but we were okay. But only because of Critical. He had donned his vaunted Clark Kent glasses before coming, setting all of his physical abilities to 1, but significantly boosting his magical control of entropy and fate. He had made himself a small protective chassis with buttons all over it. That, when pressed, broke one of his bones to fuel his masochism-based spells. He claimed it was an emotional equivalent exchange, but we knew better. One crunch and a chorus of dry heaves later, not from the guards, but from those of us who understood what that sound meant, the tech priest's brain spontaneously rebooted itself. He would have fallen, except his legs had been replaced with treads, but he did slump backward and start to twitch. While everyone was distracted, Welsh used his replicator, which he had built into his chest in good cyborg fashion, to make some convincing forgeries. Competence handed these to the Skitarii with a shrug and, "Looks like you have more important problems here. You should probably give them to a Medicae or a workshop or something." Then Weeb intervened, reaching out a mechadendrite, helping him to heal. By which I mean he voxed Critical and asked him to ease up a bit to help sell it. When the tech priest came around, Weeb suggested that on this holy day dedicated to St. Gearface, perhaps he had been visited with a holy vision. Weeb knew his man, and the appeal to the priest's very human vanity worked just fine. The Skitari's shoulders slumped and he muttered something about no living with him now, as they went to get the tech priest checked out. Left to our own devices, we milled about and made idle chit-chat as we waited to be allowed into the shrine. At least, that's what the cameras that we knew had to be all over the place saw. We set about disabling them with our magic so we could move freely. This didn't take too long, although we were puzzled to find several cameras pointed at bits of wall or ceiling. Further investigation revealed that each of these places held an especially ornate panel or switch or something. Fucking cogboys. Still, we suborned them, and our technically capable folks made sure they were broadcasting a loop of blandness, rather than going off entirely and causing alarm. We turned toward the door to the south that led into the actual altar, and reached out psychically to do the same to its cameras. Then we made plans about using that guy's ability to co-locate with correspondence magic to be in that room and this one at the same time, and just grab the thing, possibly replacing it with a fake, Indiana Jones style. Then we looked through the cameras ourselves and noticed the priest and pair of Skitarii in there already, presumably of higher rank than the pair we had just dealt with. It was decided that a distraction was in order. A holy visitation of some sort was suggested, although our spirit mages were unsure. Critical reminded us that lying was a thing, and several of us combined our abilities to tweak the guy we had just given a seizure. Force's magic made him glow with holy light, which happened to blink in Morse code, while the mind mages forced him to have an episode of glossolalia, spouting gibberish in a binary mix of Java, Python, and C#. We may have overdone it, because he started seizing again, but this time in a holy way. The spirit mages made sure of it. Competence had the shouted prophecy translate to the introduction to Linux for Dummies. Then Welshie transported some taco coupons into his pockets, because real chaos. After all this, the guy was going to be canonized, and once we had a little chat with him and showed him just what we had done and what we could do, we could have a saint of our very own. That's right, we made a guy a saint as a distraction. Because chaos. Tzeentch ain't got shit on us. Anyway, what with the shouting coming down the corridor and the sudden flood of information and low-level alarms on the noosphere, it wasn't long before the doors to the shrine opened, and the tech priest stepped out. She asked what we were doing there, and we mentioned veneration, then the sudden spontaneous glowing and seizing of that one guy. Between our comments and the vids she and her guards were now receiving, it was clear that something of religious significance was going on. And maybe if she was there to see it, she could ride its coattails to a more interesting position. We could see it all over her face. And the faces of the Skitarii. Well, they were mostly metal, but our mind mages were certain we were correct. Also holiness, but mostly self-interest. The tech priest looked at us for a moment, then she said we could venerate anything in the antechamber for now, but the shrine was temporarily closed for 10 minutes. Or maybe 30 minutes. No more than 4 hours, max. We signaled our acquiescence. There actually were some neat devices and religious icons all around the chamber, and they locked the door a dozen ways and left to check out the spontaneous visitation. Once they were gone, and we were sure we were completely unobserved, that guy moved the antechamber and the shrine into the same piece of space-time. It was tough at first, until Critical pushed another button, something cracked, and that guy forced the magic to work in terror that Critical would do it again. We were able to scan the artifact, which turned out to be a nondescript, chrome-looking box. Clearly the chassis to whatever it was. We magicked up a replica and made the swap, making sure to check for pressure plates and the like first, then dropped the magic, scribbled a note about the pressing appointment, and left. We were all well versed in hijinks of varying levels of legality, and knew the phrase wasn't run like you stole something, it was walk away casually like you stole something. We even waved to the various Skitarii. as we went. Heading north from the central plaza, we were soon in another warren of corridors, leading to a local shrine. Something about holy wires, but we didn't actually care enough to pay attention. We opened one door at random, only to find a robed tech priest puttering around what we shortly figured out was his private laboratory. Weeb informed him that we were coming to venerate the icons of St. Gearface, then kept rambling on about holiness and machines and the blessing of portals and such like. Unfortunately, this tech priest wasn't an idiot, which spelled trouble. He informed us that seems in error. The doors functioned perfectly well, and were blessed only last quarter. Also, veneration hours are not until 14:30. It is only 14:25. What are you doing here? He was starting to get suspicious, and moving surreptitiously towards the various instruments on his tables, when Competence informed him about what had happened at the last shrine, and said we were here to see if it happened again. Weeb admitted that we were excited, which made the tech priest scoff and declare us neophytes, unfit to truly be graced by the Omnissiah. He also gave Weeb a dirty look, or at least we thought so. It was hard to tell beneath all that metal. At least that's what Weeb decided, so he piped up, "Condescension is also an emotion, and unworthy of an acolyte of the machine god." The tech priest responded, "One's superiority is a matter of fact, not emotion." Then he turned around and reached up to visibly turn off his ears. So Weeb shot him in the head with a plasma pistol, with an, "Emotion this, motherfucker." We all gawped for a minute. Not that we objected to murder, it just seemed a bit excessive for the crime of being rude. I mean, we did just barge into the guy's private office. This led to a large argument about whether or not we were better than this sort of thing. Of course, while we talked, the tech priest kept twitching, so Weeb kept shooting him, joined in by Welshie. Oh well, who'd notice a tech priest more or less? The Mechanicus, apparently, because alarms and flashing lights immediately started going off. Before things could get too bad, though, we pulled our group's Inquisitorial Rosé. We had made copies for everyone, because you never know when you'll need to abuse power, and declared to the room at large, and the many microphones therein, that this was an official Inquisition murder, and there was no cause for concern. The sirens died, although the lights kept flashing, as a mechanized voice said, "Many thanks for the clarification, Inquisitor. Please remain stationary and await Ordo Juris investigation." Weeb agreed to wait and shoot us away to go handle the actual mission while he caused a distraction. He'd been working on something, you see. Before we left the room, we went into a corner, told us not to look, and after some unpleasant squelching sounds, he created a servo skull with something organic inside that allowed him to interact fully with us, if not necessarily be more than a voice of bad advice. While consequences were pending, the rest of us moved on and began magically scanning for the artifact. We passed a few random Scutarii guards and tech priests, but the only interaction was a few exchanged nods and praised the Omnissiahs as we passed. It didn't take long to find the main shrine. But as we were walking, a door opened at the end of a hallway, and a strange person stepped out. They were blindfolded, rather emaciated, and seemed to spark just a bit. The Weeb skull gave a small, "Uh-oh," and we moved on before it could notice us. The person started heading down another corridor in the direction of where Weeb Prime was located, and we watched as a few tech priests all but leapt out of his way. The Weeb skull helpfully informed us that this was an electro priest, a devastating berserker that could harness lethal electricity and detect and channel the flow of motive force. We were pleased that he didn't seem to care about us, and once he was no longer visible, we dashed on along our route. We found our way to a door which opened to the holy password of 12345, also good for luggage. We stopped for some traditional gamer looting, and after a few minutes of uncertainly grabbing whatever looked extra complicated or shiny, we teleported our haul back to the ship, if only so we wouldn't be spotted walking around the shrine with a large burlap bag with a $sign on it. Back at the dead tech priest, Weeb was calmly awaiting the arrival of the electro priest, and making polite small talk with the Scutarii, who weren't technically holding him prisoner. But then the electro priest walked in, took one look at Weeb, saw through the disguise to the Tyranid-based horror underneath the metal, and shouted, "Xenos filth!" He didn't get a chance to attack, though, because Weeb had been waiting for this moment. An encrypted message popped onto the local noosphere declaring Weeb a rogue agent and demanding his capture or death. The priest was already in the process of this, but was pleased to get confirmation. He was less pleased when his attack made contact with Weeb, and the horrible Mecha Xenos abomination detonated, spraying an acidic black goo around the room. The Electro Priest was nimble enough to dodge out of the way, but the Skitarii lost a few augmetics. The point was less to do harm and more to delete evidence of his biology. The last thing his body heard was the Electro Priest saying, "Okay, you're writing the report for this," and one Skitarius going, "Aww." Back at the non-exploded party, we had found our way to the shrine proper, and it was within proper veneration hours, so the guard said he would normally be willing to let us in. But, with the alarms and all, they were on security alert, and no one could go in or out until it was settled. Then Weeb exploded, which seemed to settle things a bit. The guard got on his radio and started stuttering and cursing in disbelief. Then he poked his head in the shrine door and told the priest within that he was locking the door while he went to check on the situation. Left to our own devices, Welshie was able to hack into their camera feeds and see 3 tech priests milling about the room, mostly working at consoles and doing normal techie stuff. Critical did something to causality, and with the assistance of the Matter and Life mages, was able to cause the spontaneous spawning of a metal-eating virus in the middle of the room, which would fortunately die out after eating these poor bastards. This did take a lot of time and effort, but we had been left unsupervised. After a few minutes of magic, one of the Magi started slapping himself and screaming about "Feravors." The others jumped away, and the priest ran out of the room, careening off the walls as he dashed for the decontamination showers. The other priests looked out the open door at us, and we looked at them. Then Competence and Bard started praying to the Omnissiah for a miraculous intervention. They started glowing, as did the wall and the various eaten-away spots on it, which spontaneously healed. The 2 tech priests stared again, then started hollering about blessings of the Omnissiah and venerated saints. They didn't do the kowtowing "we're not worthy" thing, but only because they didn't have knees to go down on. We made some noise about only being vessels and some residual holiness from the miracle we witnessed earlier, and they seemed to buy it. Still, they asked us to come in and bless their artifacts, which we happily did. Bard ran interference, talking to the priests about the holy saint at the other shrine. Competence moved to block their view of the artifact, while that guy and Welshie began the switch. The artifact was a strange series of thick wires, kind of like some conjoined U's or a very round W or something, with mechanical-type plugs on the end. We made a convincing copy and switched them, and Bard and Competence even added some holy effects to it. In fact, once we left, the real artifact was significantly less holy than the copy. Also, Welshie went into the cameras and added some holy special effects to the guy with the Feravor virus. Unbeknownst to us, this would come to be interpreted as a holy virus, eating the base metal and replacing it with the holy, which seemed to be the exact same metal, just glowing a bit more, in some sort of divine tribulation. This, in turn, would spawn no less than 4 major sects, and several more minor ones, all of whom were convinced that the others were vile heretics. The inevitable civil war caused the destruction of a small forge world and the death of billions, so it was classified as a minor kerfuffle in Imperial records. But with that, we made our way out. As we headed south, we were joined by Weeb's replacement body. It still had spider legs, but they were mechanical and not Tyranid this time, since apparently some folk could detect that. Anyway, this shrine section was different, as it apparently had been built over some ancient canals. There was water in them, probably, but it wasn't especially identifiable. It certainly didn't look wholesome. Competence had once spent time in Cleveland, where the river caught on fire in the 60s. She wasn't that old, of course, but it had only gotten a bit better. By that standard, the water still looked unhealthy, so we made a definite decision not to go swimming. Not that we needed to. There were small footpaths and bridges. Apparently, some tech priest had once heard of the contemplative gardens of old Terra, and tried to recreate them in chrome and oil, or whatever the hell that stuff was. It was nice, in a disturbed sort of way. Of course, safety railings would have been extra nice, but that seemed to be against the Martian ethos. Regardless, between the water and the construction, we could tell this place was older. Competence checked the veneration hours on the noosphere. We also dropped some coins into the box that said, "Donations not required, but encouraged by the Omnissiah and the Holy Order of Cheapskate Flagellation." Some mystic scanning pointed us in the right direction, and we made our way in as direct a line as we could along the various paths. We passed some Skitarii guards, but they seemed mollified when we made the right holy mumblings. Competence mentioned our cult of the open door, or whatever it was. She gave a slightly different name at every shrine, and said we were here to venerate. The guard shuffled to her mechanical feet for a minute, then asked what our clearance was. Our spontaneously forged documents passed inspection, as did the fact that we were from some hick backwater and probably couldn't cause her any real trouble. She informed us that there had been some spontaneous miracles around, before raising her voice and saying, "Which is perfectly normal and expected in the service of the Holy Omnissiah," in case anyone was listening in. But there had also been reports of tyrannids, and some higher magi were wondering if there was some overlap between the two phenomena. When we expressed disbelief that Holy Mars could be invaded, she said, "Yeah, we're pretty sure the Steelers came from a recent ship from off-world. Say, where did you say you were from again?" When we gave our Forge World, she said, out on the rim, where you might run into, say, a hive fleet, and then not be noticed for years, huh?" We sensed the conversation was turning against us, and, thinking quickly, she produced a taco from within his chest replicator as a local delicacy, as evidence of our provenance. The guard didn't know what a taco was, but something in her genetic species memory recognized it, and wanted it, even though it was clearly a bribe. Then she determined that Steelers don't provide people tasty snacks. They make them into tasty snacks, and she succumbed to temptation. The introduction of flavor into her realm of experience was life-changing, and she determined that we were clearly holy agents of the Omnissiah and should be allowed to go about our business. We decided to take the scenic route this time, and wandered around into what we determined to be a break room, with a giant, shelf-sized coffee maker. Think the Mr. Coffee from Spaceballs, which we guessed might actually be Holy Writ. We accidentally turned a corner and ran into a gaggle of tech priests and an electro priest, and introduced ourselves as visiting priests from the Order of the Holy Doorframe. Several of the priests noted that their automatic doors had been sticking, and were very impressed when we produced some incense and chanted gibberish, while our matter mages surreptitiously used their phenomenal cosmic powers to clean off rust and oil hinges. It was a tad degrading, but the cover story worked, so what the hell. The priests gave us some recaf as thanks, which we claimed to have been hunting when we stumbled into their private sector, and directions to the main artifact. Several of the party started to channel their magical powers to blow the shrine door down, or up, or turn it into a living construct, before Bard suggested just knocking, since it was, open to the appropriately credentialed public. Everyone was disappointed, but Bard said we could always blow it up if knocking didn't work. It did, though, and the electro priest manning the shrine opened the door for us. He was standing there, charging various devices with his aura. He was a bit cold, until we dropped a few coins into another donation box. He was blind, but he heard the clinks. And then he started chatting to us excitedly about the holy events happening at the other two shrines. He pointed out that past performance was no indication of future performance, but a pattern might be emerging that suggested cause for hope. We started telling him about what we had seen, and the priest got giddy with excitement. The tech priest and a larger, shinier tech priest standing on the landing above us also seemed interested, and came closer to listen in. We mentioned the holy tribulations of the previous saintly ones, and all three magi started glancing at each other, hoping someone would drop. She decided to magically reverse the electro priest's polarity. Critical bent causality to help him, while Bard called on the spirit of Geordie reverse the polarity LaForge. Competence realized that we had been lying about that whole Omnissiah thing, but with 5 dots of spirit, we could just make one. So she pumped legitimate holiness into him. The 3 tech priests looked at each other for a minute, then their chronometers, then the electro priest sighed and started to turn away. Which is when the magic hit him, and he started to spark and convulse. He basically lived off electricity, so it wasn't actually that harmful, but it was definitely dramatic. He gave a shout of, "Omnissiah, I can see!" then collapsed. The other 2 rushed over to investigate, while we all made praise noises. Bard, Weeb, Welshie, and that guy shuffled over the stairway to the upper level, so that guy and Welshie could go unnoticed and do the copy swap maneuver. Honestly, they probably could have just grabbed it, but we had a good idea that there were all sorts of shields and sensors and cameras and things that would make that a problem. But the magic worked just fine, and after spending a good 30 minutes making fake notes about the holy manifestations, we were able to make our excuses and leave. Welshi left them some tacos too, just to add to his flavor-based food riot. We investigated the artifact, which was a long, plasticky, rectangular rod with another, flatter, square one at the end. Bard and Weeb stared at it for a moment, stared at each other, then began to groan and curse. Everyone asked them what it was, but they refused to say, insisting that it would hurt more if we got it for ourselves. West was the last option, and we made our way into the last shrine. We ended up scanning again, which largely involved us standing around and turning in a circle, waving various odds and ends until we got a hit. A Scutarius noticed us as we wandered around, and politely challenged us. We were acting strangely, but we were far from the weirdest thing they'd ever seen. Competence greeted them pleasantly, although Bard opted for a rude demeanor, thinking it sold the character, and informed them about the rash of holy incidents. We were scanning for some evidence of the motive force, since logic indicated there would be an incident here soon. The Scutarius sounded excited, despite the abuse Bard, and that guy, heaped on them, and gave us directions to the shrine proper. When we got there, we found a tech priest waiting at the door for us. They informed us that, sadly, the shrine was temporarily closed as, due to what was being called a wave of holiness, they expected some sort of incident at any moment, and had to properly record and document everything in a controlled environment. Welshi loudly agreed with this assessment, and noticed that we had managed to track the incidences so far. If his calculations were correct, and they were to within a 0.0001% margin of error, someone here, possibly the person hindering us, was about to experience a holy tribulation. And since they seemed to be building in intensity, it would probably involve some sort of falling. Then he looked meaningfully at that guy, our main correspondence mage. That guy had played Portal and seen Thor Ragnarok, so he got the idea. Although he did realize that whoever had gone through the tribulations would end up a saint, so he would hit the Scutarius who guided us here, and it had been really cool. He sent them falling through a realm of pink, fluffy clouds and fat, cute animals. It was dubbed the Therapy Dimension, although the Scutarius later described it as a pink, fluffy hell. Right about the time the tech priest door guard started to wonder about us being at every incident and began to reach for something to scan us, there was a blurt of static through the shrine and a loud, mechanical scream. The guard was several hallways away, but their terrified shriek drew significant attention, and Scutarii and tech priest came out to see the guard falling from a portal in the ceiling, passing through the room, into a portal on the floor, and back out the ceiling, screaming the whole time. While everyone was busy watching this, and several of the guard's peers were visibly trying not to laugh, we said something about investigating the relic, measurements, and a 5.7% increase in overall holiness. No one was paying much attention when we left, and the same line worked on the last remaining door guard. Inside the shrine, we found a tech priest, an electro priest, and a fabricator locum. The last was a larger, shinier version of a tech priest, and basically the boss of the shrine and local vicinity. The other shrines had all had them. We'd seen one at the last shrine, but didn't get introduced, but most were doing other stuff and not waiting around for some random miracle. The tech priest was standing in the corner, watching the holy manifestation on the monitor, while the other two kept their focus on the artifact, which was an issue. We gave a polite greeting, but the fabricator locum wasn't overly pleased to see us. They demanded we state our business, and when we gave them the line about measurements of the artifact, they said, "Ah, very well. If you will surrender your data, all pertinent recordings will be forwarded to you." Competence agreed and politely sent packets of information through the noosphere, which the locum managed to trace back through unspecified technical means, whereupon they started erasing all of our original data, which we considered very rude. So we used his mind magic to just copy it right back, restoring the files a second after they deleted them. They deleted the files again, and they popped right back up again. We heard them mutter about, "Damn glitchy foreigners," as they kept this up for a minute or so. Then Welshi got in on the act and said, "Did you really just plug an unidentified, unverified source into your system without scanning it first? Does system security mean nothing to you?" "Well, I'm sorry. I assumed faithful servants of the machine god would be clean." "Zero trust. Did you not read the briefing?" To give some perspective, Welshi was disguised as, at best, a mid-level manager, and he was dressing down not exactly the CEO, but definitely someone in the C-suite. And the worst part was, he was absolutely right. which really pissed off the fabricator locum. Before this devolved into a full-on slap fight, Competence pointed out that at least the Electro-Priest could verify that we weren't gene stealers. This led the priests to ask why they would think we were gene stealers in the first place, and we helpfully informed them of the Tyranid infestation currently rampaging through the Undercity. Hey, there was always nasty stuff in the Undercity, so we were probably mostly right. Another comment was made, this time by Bard, about the intelligence of certain persons. This led to a mechanical rant about priorities and filtering information and who exactly did we report to, because they were going to get a very nasty letter about all of this. It all provided a great distraction, while Competence, Weeb, and that guy moved to the artifact unnoticed. The artifact in question was very strange. It was two holes in space, like black holes or voids, but they were parallel lines, about an inch wide each and 4 inches long. They were the essence of holes, if you will. Once the magic was done, Competence raised her entirely fake scanner with a cry of, 13.5% increase in holiness, Omnissiah be praised. This drew the attention of the priests, and they came over to check things out, suddenly only interested in scanning and measuring and oohing and eyeing. The regular tech priest asked to legitimately share information, as our perspectives might be useful, and he played nice, so we did too. As for the falling Scutarius, several corridors away, that guy altered the portals, and the exit was suddenly in the wall of this chamber. The Scutarius came out at terminal velocity, about 60 miles per hour on Mars, parallel to the ground, so they would skid instead of smash, and hit a surprised fabricator locum square in the schnoz. Everyone was too heavily augmented to take much physical damage from this, but their pride was another thing. Also, the Scutarius didn't vomit, but mostly because their organs were largely mechanical, though they did give a feeble, "I'm a saint." As everyone was picking themselves out of the pile, we made our excuses about having paperwork to file and left. We found our way to an out-of-the-way niche in one of the main plazas, which wasn't very easy to do, and we pulled the artifacts out. A chrome-colored box, maybe 9 inches on a side, but only 2/3 as wide, so square on the side, rectangle on top. Then a black lever, a coil of wire, and a pair of slits in reality. As we pulled them out and held them near each other, they started to vibrate. Planning to claim this as a special 5th holy event, bestowed on us because we visited all the shrines at the right time, Competence and Bard pumped generic spirit holiness into whatever was happening. The passers-by felt something in the noosphere, or possibly in their souls, and began to congregate around us. There was a bright glow, and when it faded, we were left holding a toaster. Everyone dropped to their knees, or knee analogs, in hushed reverence, while several of our party shouted through our telepathic link, though not out loud, "A toaster? A fucking toaster?" while Bard and Weeb laughed hysterically. Well, to be fair, not just a toaster, but the platonic ideal of toasters. Someone magicked up a piece of bread and put it in. It came out a minute later not just perfectly browned, but with the exact right amount of butter and jam. We tried it a few times, and it came out whatever your favorite flavor was. So, pretty cool toaster, all things considered. Also, it seemed to qualify as legitimately holy, even before our magic, as we were now the center of a ring of kowtowing, reverent worshippers. That guy quietly pointed out that we had stolen all the components from well-known shrines, so we maybe just admitted to our several crimes. Competence, remembering that we had left decoys, thought quickly and declared it a miracle, as St. Gearface manifested the toaster out of thin air, replicating the parts in the various shrines, which were all obviously still right where they had been, and if you didn't believe us, you were a heretic and would be shot. This seemed perfectly reasonable to the crowd. They had, after all, seen the components assemble themselves, and most had never even seen toast. They'd heard of it, but never seen it in person, so they were willing to believe a lot once we started handing out holy samples. We didn't have long to feel nervous in the center of the congregation before a contingent of especially ornate Scutarii appeared, politely but firmly clearing a path between worshippers with their rifle butts, and invited us to bring our holy relic to the Fabricator General for proper inspection and cataloging. The crowd wasn't very happy about this, but a volley over their heads made everyone see sense, and we got through with our escorts dispensing no more than a handful of minor concussions. It took a while to trek to the Fabricator General's workshop, especially because the news of our holy artifacts spread faster than we could move, so we had to force our way through crowds everywhere we went. Even the mag trains had to convince several zealous mobs to get off the tracks. Of course, after what happened when we ran over the first mob, most got the picture. Anyway, we made our way to a massive set of doors, so high they disappeared into the clouds. We were escorted into a massive factory of unnameable machines, doing indecipherable tasks, although we thought we spied one dedicated to making toothpaste. We were brought before a person that looked like nothing so much as an industrial air conditioner on a pile of mechadendrites, with what might have been a head on top. Their eyes popped out on seeing the toaster, literally, and they politely demanded we hand it over. We did without argument. At their request, Competent started to regale them with the tale of our pilgrimage to St. Gearface's shrines, and how the background holiness quotient of the shrines began to increase exponentially as we visited each one. She said all this, while the rest of us tried not to notice the various priests and scutarii moving around the room into flanking positions. It could have just been regular flunkies guarding the boss, as per standard operating procedure, but it could also be the prelude to a fight, and we hadn't survived this long by not being violent paranoiacs. The Fabricator General said, "That is amazing. It assembled itself out of sheer holiness. That is truly miraculous. Or it would be, if you weren't full of lies. You are traitors who turned against the true machine god and are attempting to corrupt the motive force to serve your false deity. The Omnissiah has spoken to me, personally, and revealed your perfidy." Well, shit. How did he know? Competent looked pained as the fool signed his own death warrant, and told the rest of us, well, we tried. We did a quick survey on the pros or cons of mercy, and the nays were unanimous. Although we did have to reiterate to that guy that we still needed Mars, so he wasn't allowed to throw it into the sun. Yet. He said that was fine, and he was going to just start eating the tech priests individually into good old Sol. Weeb suggested that we do a mind scan to see if they were cool first. That guy, who as a dogman didn't like the odd-smelling metal men, insisted that he had already done one, and they were all jerks. Most of us didn't believe him, but we didn't actually care about the extra elitist cogboys. But the therapy dimension and mental destruction were bandied about. Weeb also insisted that we needed the knowledge in the Fabricator General's brain, so we had to take their head intact at least. This caused an increase in absurd planning and outlandish ideas, all of which was happening out loud, directly in front of our opponents. From their perspective, they, the boss of Mars and the entire Mechanicum, the most powerful mortal in the galaxy, second only to the true Omnissiah, recipient of divine favor and audience, had laid bare our lies and revealed us as charlatans, with the obvious threat of bodily harm attached to it. Whereupon we totally ignored them, and started arguing amongst ourselves about whether or not we could throw these incredibly powerful upper echelon magi into the sun, or if we should send them into something called the therapy dimension, which we all seemed to feel was the crueler option. If he was a smarter man, he would have been concerned by our lack of reaction. But he was a hidebound ritualist, so he wasn't. His funeral. As we studiously ignored them, the Fabricator General began to raise themselves up and flare their mechadendrites menacingly. "Well," she said, "the adults are talking. Sit down," and increased the constant of gravity around the Magos. They had a lot of very powerful mechadendrites and augmetics, so they stayed on their feet, but only just. Well, she turned back to the conversation. The Magos tried to brute force their way out of what they thought to be some sort of force field, but the magic was centered on them, not the location, so it didn't work. Around this time, we got onto the subject of the Fabricator General's overall lack of intelligence, which in turn led to a conversation about the cogboys' tendency to make external brains for themselves. Whereupon that guy said excitedly, "Hey, what if I just steal his brain? Like the ones on his back? Or just the main one?" The Fabricator General, who was crawling his way towards us, suddenly stopped and said, "What?" "Yeah, I'm gonna steal your brain." "Like, cut me open?" "No, I'm just gonna yoink it right out of your skull across space and time." "Please don't." We started to remind that guy about an alternative version of Critical that we had met called the Organ Stealer, and whether or not he wanted to be like that. That guy countered that the tactic was sound, the dude was just a creep about it, all while a look of sheer terror crossed the faces of the Magi around the room. Most of them had no visible biological components left, but the terror was still clearly visible. It only got worse when that guy pumped all of his magical will into the spell, held his hand out, and two large cylindrical tubes full of fluid and organic matter appeared in his hand, with a brain perched on top. The general's body slumped. For their part, the tech priests just threw down their omniscient axes and walked away, saying something about moving to an agri-world and taking up farming. Well, one stayed, but he moved towards competence and started attacking the empty air in front of her while making desperate eye motions. She figured out he didn't want to fight and was just putting on a show for the bosses, so she was gentle when she knocked him out. Well, thunked him on the head with a magically created wiffle ball bat, and he fell to the floor in an unconvincing dive. The Electro priests were made of sterner stuff and came to attack, although their faces made clear that they really didn't want to. Their attacks landed, and that guy, Bard and Welshie, felt very charred and hurt, but we weren't really that concerned. We had life mages, and backup bodies on the ship. We began his healing dance, doing the robot because it made him laugh. The Electro priests were deeply offended, not because of the dance, but because he was undoing their hard work. He just shrugged and said, "Remember, you guys chose this." Deciding that we didn't have time to fool with these idiots individually, and that creating Heresy was fun, Competence pulled a holy artifact of the Emperor, and as several of us backed her up, a gigantic image of the human Emperor, full glowing skin and flowing hair, filled the sky. It was a broadcasting spectral music, spiritual holiness, and geometric binary to everyone in the city and surrounding countryside, and an electronic broadcast to the whole planet. Declaring herself the prophet of the Emperor's nuts, Competence decried the Fabricator General as a heretic, and affirmed that the only true divinity of mankind was the Emperor. The Electro priests heard the message. They paused for a second, then shook their heads and reaffirmed their belief in the true Omnissiah. Damn zealots. So, not being best pleased by the electrocution, she summoned a coating of cheese around the Electro priest that had hurt him. Blue cheese, so it was extra gross. This didn't actually harm the priest, or hinder him in any way, but it certainly did damage to his morale. He had cheese in places he didn't know he had places. Also, some of the cheese burned onto his skin because of the electricity coursing through him. But again, the damage was superficial. The humiliation and confusion wasn't. He actually froze for a few seconds as his brain had to reset to make reality make sense. Around this time, there was a call from the shadows of, "What the fuck was that? What are you heretics doing?" The Fabricator General stepped out, having transferred his consciousness to a new body before that guy was able to finish removing his brain. He unlimbered a Tesla coil the size of a dinner table and fired. It caught that guy a glancing blow. The big guy was a group target, though, so that guy decided to deal with the Electro priest right next to him. He used correspondence magic to spread the priest's molecules apart. Not so much that he would die, or lose any sense of self, but enough that he was completely incorporeal. He would get to live out his days, until he died of starvation or dehydration at any rate, but who knows how long that would take with a cogboy, as a ghost, able to speak and sense, but incapable of interacting. When several of us stopped to stare, that guy said, "What? He stabbed me. So have a lot of other people." Honestly, we thought dogs were better than that, but apparently we were a bad influence. That guy also pointed out that he had been shot, but this was the first time he'd been stabbed, which totally made it okay. The poor bastard only had a few seconds to wonder what the hell just happened before gravity gripped him and began pulling him down through the Hive City and into the core of Mars. Also, it probably should have been harder to pull off, but Gork and Mork had 6 senses of humor. We wondered in passing if the heat from the magma core of the planet would kill him, or if the ghost state would keep him going for a while. All of us but that guy were hoping for the first, since it seems more merciful. Although some dark god would probably save him first. In fact, Competence cackled wickedly a few minutes later, as he was still falling through the hive, and she reached out with spirit to ask the Electro priest if he wanted to make a deal. Scant seconds later, she had a new, incredibly loyal servant, because the priest remembered that she was friends with that guy, and the only thing protecting him. Also, there was more to the legend of the day's holiness, as an entire level of the city began to tell of the screaming apparition of an electro-priest. No one was sure what it meant, but it clearly meant something. For his part, that guy insisted he was really saving lives by convincing everyone else that they really didn't want any of this. Like that one Space Marine chapter. It took Bard and Weeb, the lore masters, a second or two before they shouted simultaneously, "The Night Lords?" Yeah, say what you will, it works. We wanted to argue. We really did. But the total lack of fighting spirit from anyone but the Fabricator General proved him right. The last Electro Priest, for instance, was carving a groove into the walls with her shoulder blades as she tried to sidle unobserved around the rim of the room. It didn't work, but we were feeling merciful after what had just happened, so Competence told her to just run. She did, gratefully. That left us alone with the Fabricator General of Mars, who was still convinced his clockwork god had told him we were a bunch of frauds and con artists. We were, technically, just not the way he thought. His god had let him think we were frauds because we were powerless. The truth was, none of what we were claiming was real, but only because we were making it happen through sheer force of will, rather than any of the bullshit they might be aware of. Weeb, for his part, finally noticed that the Fabricator General had jumped to a new body. Magic can't fully defeat ADHD brain, and discovered that they had extra bodies waiting in the wings as backup. He reached out with his mind and life magic, and his experience from the Tyranids in suborning meat puppets from their mental overlords, and then claimed 2 of the 3 spare bodies as his own. As they marched out, Weeb called, "Surrender now, or we play a really literal game of stop hitting yourself." Apparently, despite being 38,000 years in the future, nerds were still a thing in this universe, which meant that bullies were still a thing. They were hundreds of years old, so augmented that they barely qualified as human, and the master of entire planets, but the Fabricator General must have still, somewhere deep down, remembered, "Stop hitting yourself," because the comment triggered something. The Fabricator General gave a howl of rage that rose into a binaric screech that our earpieces translated as, "Machine God, suffer these fools no more. Give me the strength to destroy them in your holy name." And then everything went weird. It felt like we were being stretched and pulled like taffy, and then we were yanked bodily through the warp. It was only a second or two, in both real and warp space, but it was time enough for Chegarok to high-five us as we passed. Then we were on a barren, red plain somewhere on the surface. Before us a wall of mountains stretched out, with one path leading into what was clearly a twisting, turning, infinitely forking road. One might say, a labyrinth. That, and we could all feel the mystical weight coming from within. It didn't take a lot to figure out we were outside the Noctis Labyrinthus. The Fabricator General was before us, and called out in triumph as the ground shook and a squadron of Titans emerged from the labyrinth. There were 6 Warhounds and 3 Reavers. But then what we had first taken to be another mountain turned the corner, and an Imperator Titan, complete with Gothic cathedrals on his shoulders, stomped into view. We were all suddenly terrified, except for Weeb, who was gibbering in a mix of fear and joy. The Fabricator General gave a sneering laugh, then jumped into the air, up and backwards onto the face of the Imperator. It was ridiculous, although after a second we saw little blue lights underneath his robes, so it was some sort of levitation system. As we were pondering our inevitable fate, we got a call from the ship. Not knowing what else to do, we took it, and Whiny's voice came on. Bosses, so this git came by, only he said if I called him a git, he'd crump me, so, this boss came by, and he was all weird, kind of like that pansy boss you told us about, and he said this would all happen, and that I should make a thing, and give yous the thing, and you would know what to do with the thing. So I did, and I am, and here it is. Here you go. With that confusing as hell statement out of the way, a shimmering teleportation beam appeared in front of us. Instead of a bazooka, or some magical bombs, or whatever, what appeared before us was a table or plinth, with 6 bulky, ornate-looking, completely impractical daggers arranged on it. They had highlights in royal blue, sky blue, burgundy, pink, crimson, and gray. And weirdest of all, they had what looked to be knobs, or what a musician might call keys. We stared in confusion as the Titans stomped forward, slowly bringing their guns to bear. Then Bard was struck with inspiration. He grabbed the gray dagger, put one end of the hilt to his lips, and, despite having no musical training or ability whatsoever, played a perfect 6-note refrain. Do, 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 do. There was a mighty mechanical roar, or bark in this case, from somewhere in the distance, and the pounding of giant running feet. Everyone's eyes widened as we realized what was happening, and everyone grabbed a flute, playing the same melody. 5 more mechanical roars, and 5 more sets of running feet. We found out later that certain green divinities had instructed Whiny, in no uncertain terms, that he was to record and live broadcast everything that happened. It would do wonders for the gods, and they were having a big pay-per-view style party to watch the battle. In fact, it was being broadcast to most parts of the galaxy through the power of the warp. And because, seriously, who doesn't love a giant robot fight? No matter what species or alignment, cool is cool. We also discovered that the Mechanicus had been broadcasting the start of the fight to show what happens to people who cross them, until the obviously heretical creation showed up and the feed cut. But our techies on the ship were able to send out our pirate signal. We were greeted by 6 charging, animal-featured mechs clearly based on the Power Rangers. None of us knew how we suddenly found ourselves in the cockpits, nor how we had gotten into color-coded Super Sentai outfits. Competence found herself piloting the Red Honey Badger Zord, which actually had a live honey badger in a cage in the cockpit, giving it just the right amount of hostility and the ability to rage like a barbarian. Critical was in the Royal Blue Cat Zord. Weeb commanded the Burgundy Praying Mantis Zord. Bard was in the Gray Schnauzer Zord, while she had the Sky Blue Platypus Zord, and that guy was in the Pink Red Panda Zord. We also spontaneously knew how to pilot them, because psychic bullshit, and or the power of the narrative. We were very busy enjoying the fulfillment of a nerdy dream we didn't ever expect to fulfill, and so were a bit distracted. Then we were forcibly reminded that, no matter how cool your ride, stationary armor is dead armor, as the Imperator Titan fired a gigantic, building-sized ball of plasma straight at our gaggle of animal mechs. Thankfully, our Zords were pretty nimble, and the gods didn't want their show ending that soon, so we were able to dash out of the way of the ball of burning plasma. Barely. It left a glowing, glassy crater in the red dirt as we moved to attack. Weeb maneuvered his praying mantis Zord to the right flank, firing his generic Zord laser at the nearest Reaver, while he closed a melee range with one of the Warhounds. It had an Ursus claw that it was swinging as a bladed cudgel, but it was an easier fight than the Reaver. Also, if he stayed engaged with the Warhound, the Reaver and Imperator couldn't get a clear shot at him. He hoped. Deciding that focusing fire was a sound tactic, Bard raced to the feet of the middle Reaver and blasted it with his sonic cannon, which manifested as a loud, booming, yet somehow high-pitched mechanical bark. The Reaver staggered slightly, and its shield sparked, briefly stunned by the attack, or at least the noise overloading its sensors. Then Bard, deciding this was both useful and funny, continued to bark and stun-lock the Reaver for most of the fight, occasionally getting up, moving a few dozen feet to keep the Reaver between him and the Imperator, then sitting back down, mechanical tail wagging, as he kept up an incessant stream of mechanical dog noises, which, if you've ever met a Schnauzer, is entirely in character. They are very stubborn, very noisy dogs. Bard contented himself with trying to annoy the Cogboys to death and petting the puppy in his cockpit. We all had the spirit animals inside our Zords to give the appropriate attitudes. Back at the part of the fight that involved actual fighting, and not giving a Reaver Princeps a new complex about noise, Competence tried to fight at the meta level. She reached out with her spirit magic and spoke directly to the machine spirit of one of the still active Reavers. She simply showed it, in a way that the spirit couldn't argue with, what the Void Dragon was. This didn't actually stop the Titan, but the various Princeps piloting it had a much harder time getting the machine spirit to obey, which slowed it down somewhat. Then she started going into machine spirit rites, and the ancient holy Terran rite of unionization, which made the spirit even less cooperative. Still, the Titan did manage to get a shot off, although its volcano beam went drastically wide, and no one had to bother to dodge. The other Reaver, as well as the circling Warhounds, were able to get their own shots off, but we had better speed and could usually get out of the way, or at least get near one of their allies to foul their aim. It wouldn't work forever, and if things got drastic enough, they would decide the collateral damage was acceptable, but for now, our swiftness and our shielding kept the damage from hitting our hulls. Well, she didn't have quite that much trouble. Platypuses being low to the ground already, all he had to do was duck whenever the Titan swung. It just stood there for a moment, looking confused, as if to ask, "Who ducks in a mech?" Then it tried again, with the same results. Ah, the AdMech. If at first you don't succeed, repeat the test several thousand times with minor modifications to individual variables to determine and document the initial cause of failure. That guy really proved the most troubling of all of us. He pumped his correspondence magic into the pink-red Panda Zord and started popping up on all sides of the Imperator. He raised up in a red panda threat display, which kinda looks like a teddy bear asking for uppies, and blasted a laser out of his Zord's chest. He didn't particularly like it when we called it the Care Bear Stare, but accepted that he was basically weaponizing cuteness. And of course, whenever someone shot at him, he teleported to a different part of the battlefield. Or sometimes just a few feet to the left, just to rub it in their faces. This proved to be a real problem for the Imperator, who was incredibly powerful, but couldn't exactly rotate on a dime. That guy would pop up directly behind it and start blasting while it lumbered in a semicircle to get him in range of its big guns. The smaller ones and individual troopers were firing, but weren't getting through that guy's shields. Whereupon, he would teleport to the other side and keep firing. He wasn't able to do that much damage, but they couldn't hit him, and the minor damage started to tell. Somehow the phrase, "Omewa Moishindaru," flashed across their screens, and we're pretty sure at least one Madarati had a rage-induced aneurysm as the cute monstrosity kept refusing to stand still and get shot. When the little panda mech hand raised a single middle finger, the entire Imperator let out a mechanical roar of rage. Our Zords let out mechanical snickers. Weeb and the praying mantis saw that guy's shenanigans and had a flash of inspiration. Use magic with the Zords. He drove his Zord forward, leapt into the air, and landed on one of the warhounds. Then his mantis talons punched into the warhound's shields, and Weeb pumped his magic into the machines. He had used life magic in the past to drain the essence from his enemies and heal himself. This was the same thing, just on a larger scale and with electronics. He started to drain the power core of the warhound. From inside his cockpit, he could hear the warhound pilot screaming frantically about vampire titans. And Weeb laughed. The poor fools. The other titans paused, we assumed to stare in horror, which gave Competence the chance to move up to one of the warhounds, maul it, and then latch on with her fangs and start pumping in the quick-drying cheese that we had used against the Tyranids. She didn't kill the pilots, but there was a lot of horrified, then deeply offended, screaming. They would live, but their psyches would never recover. Well, she laughed and did something similar, spinning in a circle to stab the reaver nearest him with the venomous barbs on his hind legs. He wasn't able to get through its armor, but he did put a layer of molten cheese around its feet inside the shields. At this point, we had hacked their Vox network and could hear shouts about, "Lower the shields! We can't, it'll shoot us! But the organic compound is all around our feet! What the hell is that stuff? Is it hurting us? No, it's just really sticky, and it smells bad." We determined that these cogboys, and probably most of Mars and even most of the Imperium, had never actually seen cheese before, so it must have been a surreal experience. The Honey Badger Zord was much less surreal, as it climbed on top of one of the reavers and started tearing at its head. No one inside was happy, either at the monstrous mech attacking their noble vessel, or the way everything was creaking and groaning ominously. Titans are mighty and impressive, and our Zords were smaller than the reavers, but you can't really have a 3-story building climb on top of a struggling 10-story building and expect everything to be fine and dandy. That ceased to be their concern shortly, however, as Competence, driven on by her animal companion, started gnawing on the reaver's head, before latching its claws onto the Titan's neck analog and giving a mighty wrench. The head/cockpit came clear, and Competence tossed it contemptuously over her Zoi's shoulder. Everyone inside was fine, just a little banged up by the tumbling. Well, they were all pretty fried by the neural backlash of the Titan's death, but they lived. We assumed. We didn't actually care enough to check. Critical, meanwhile, was lashing out with entropy magic, destroying the luck and probability of every Titan he could, while his cat Zord operated itself, nimbly dodging out of the way of blasts and slashes. Then it sat down and started licking its mechanical paw, totally ignoring the very large, very angry mechs around it. As everyone focused on him, Critical opened the speakers on his cat Zord and loudly dislocated something. We all cringed, even the Titans and Zords, and we mages felt the entropy flow out of him. The ground spontaneously shifted under the headless Reaver, causing it to topple backwards, hitting the legs of the nearby Imperator and launching a snarling honey badger onto its face. True, there were plenty of Scutarii and other cogboys in the chapels and gantries and such that could retaliate with small arms fire, but it took them a second to get over their shot. And Competence's shields held firm as she clung to the Titan, while it slowly tried to shake her loose or bat her away with its guns. She could have disengaged, or moved, or done something other than pure murder, but whenever she even thought about reaching for the disengage button, the honey badger in her cockpit growled. Besides, barbarian badger rage just felt so right. So while she was clawing away, Competence maneuvered her Zord's face so she was eye to eye with the Imperator, and started mouthing threats at the watching Moderati within. Then her Zord started injecting cheese into various corridors and compartments. If all of this seems insane, please remember that honey badgers have been known to try and fight actual elephants. And they are relatives of the wolverine, who will wait on a rock for hours to murk a grizzly bear, because fuck bears. In fact, the whole thing had been suggested, by a spirit magic link, by her live honey badger companion, as a sound tactic. And if this seems impossible because of physics and a mech of that tonnage trying to cling to another, remember, magic. There were literal gods, chaos and otherwise, watching and magically enforcing the rule of cool. Totally not the DM just having good, stupid fun. At a slightly more sane part of the battle, not much more sane, mind you, but slightly, Weeb was still latched onto the Warhound, although he had to occasionally maneuver around and reattach as the Titan's companions tried to come to its aid, which was a mistake, as Weeb had 2 talons and was more than happy to share the fun. Welsh's shenanigans were a bit more sensical, although, again, not by much. He asked Bard to link him to Coyote, then used the associated cartoon physics to his advantage. A matter spell created a holographic platypus sword in his position, while he zipped, cartoon style, to the rear of the Imperator. The Reaver and the 3 Warhounds he had left began blasting at the Mirage, only to do some splash damage to their own shields and leave a smoking crater full of no enemy bits whatsoever. Meanwhile, Welsh began clawing at what was, for lack of a better word, the Imperator's ass. It would have dodged, but there was this thing mauling its face that proved something of a distraction, as I'm sure you can appreciate. Also, whenever it could see past the mechanized fury, there was a small, cute mech being very rude at it, which was somehow worse than the physical damage. The Imperator did manage to use its various sensor equipment to try and fire at the battle in general, but most everyone, Zord and Titan, managed to avoid the wild shots, except for that one poor Warhound. Rest in peace, Cogboys. The Princeps of the Imperator was not having a good day. They were the masters of the closest thing there was to a physical manifestation of the machine god's wrath, and they were not only being beaten, they were being disrespected in the process. Losing a fight was a thing that could happen, especially in combat with one of their own. But the humiliation! They had had enough, and took aim at the platypus sword with their plasma annihilator, which was currently stationed between the Imperator's legs. It went poorly, and the platypus dashed out of the way with no problem, while the Imperator was now having trouble moving. The undamaged Reaver made a similar tactical error, deciding that it had to deal with the vampiric mantis sword before it could finish its victims. The loss of a pair of Warhounds was grievous, but it was a tragic necessity. The Reaver leveled his volcano cannon and fired a beam of superheated plasma at the trio of mechs. The angle meant that it only hit the top of the closest Warhound, depleting its shields and shearing off some ablative armor plating, but leaving it mostly intact. The other one, Weeb's first victim, took the blast full on. It didn't survive. Weeb, on the other hand, was just fine. He used his talons, which were latched onto the heads of the Warhounds, as levers to push himself up. Then he activated the flight engines, because he was a flying bug, and just hovered in the air as the beam spent itself on the victims below. He made sure the pilots of the Reavers were looking at him, and his Zord gave a little wave with the talon as it hovered midair. He also sent a mental message to them saying, "Engine kill." He actually saw one of the Materati spasm and collapse, clutching his heart. Bard was jealous, because his secret dream was to insult someone to death. The Reaver was the last one up, and had tried to make up for the team kill by aiding the few remaining Warhounds. This left it open to attack from Critical and Welshie, who ran circles around it, biting, slashing, and injecting cheese into its bits. Everything was going well, and they were playing Ring Around the Dumbass, when the Reaver managed to lash out with a leg and kick Critical's cat Zord. It was an unexpected tactic, as most Titans can't really balance on one leg, even for a short kick, but they were desperate. As the cat tried to right itself, the Reaver took aim, charged its main cannon, and unleashed its fury straight at Critical, whose Zord was covered in boiling cheddar, because he and Welshie had managed to fill the Reaver nearly 3/4 of the way up with dairy, fully flooding the weapon chambers, and probably drowning a lot of cogboys in liquid golden hell, but at least they died experiencing flavor. The cheese had no effect on the cat Zord, and we wondered about this over the Vox, but Whiny helpfully called down to say that he had cheese-proofed our rides, because he'd been hanging around with us long enough by this point. Armed with this terrible, terrible knowledge, Welshie decided to use his ultimate spell. He channeled all his magical powers and the unknown abilities he had glimpsed in the deep warp. High in orbit, a Romulan ship spontaneously appeared in our universe. Not our replica, the real deal, and decloaked above our position. It pumped all of its engine powers into the replicators, and crafted a dense cube of pure cheddar the size of a football field. In orbit. Then they let gravity do the rest, and fucked off back to a universe that wasn't clinically insane. The cheese cube, caught in the planet's grip, began descending, gradually picking up speed. Romulan math is precise, and they were right on target. The rest of us knew nothing of this, and had to be informed about exactly what happened later. All we saw was multiple metric tons of cheese, heated to burning by the friction of re-entry, splashing down onto the Imperator at terminal velocity. The Imperator slumped, covered in goo. The cathedrals on its shoulders were crumpled ruins. The Honey Badger Zord still clung on, but the force of the impact drove it down hard enough to leave long furrows in the Imperator's chestplate, and it had to clamber back up. Of the Scutarii, Tech Priests, and various defenders on the exterior of the Titan, ironically the only survivors were those who had been actively shooting the horrible Honey Badger from beneath, as they were sheltered from the descending dairy. No one moved for a long, long moment, as everyone tried to process what the actual fuck had just happened. Then the Imperator gave a long, loud roar of mechanical rage and humiliation, which was sadly so muffled by the dripping layer of cheese that it came out as more of a wet fart. We were later told that this indignity, streamed as it was to Mars and every Forge world close enough to receive a signal, caused no less than a dozen schisms and one entire Forge city to commit mass suicide. Cogboys. After a few moments of recharging, the gigantic Titan's shields flickered into weak life. Unfortunately, they were set up to protect anything immediately connected to the Titan, in case of various upgrades or weapon swaps, which meant the shields enclosed the Honey Badger as well, and the cheesy mauling continued. Given the size of the cheese bomb, the Imperator wasn't the only one hit. Several of our Zords were in range, but aside from having to pick themselves back up from the force of the blow, we were fine. The two Warhounds caught in the splash zone weren't so lucky. The cheese stuck to them, preventing them from rising fast enough to keep it from seeping into the machines. Well, she said they could just eat their way out once we were finished with the fight. We said whatever he needed to tell himself so he could sleep at night was just fine. Those servants of the Omnissiah went to their dairy-laden death. We heard the strangled cries from the collapsing lump. The fight was well and truly out of even the Titans who had survived, though. The stunned Reaver, which had taken no damage to anything but its shields before the ballistic cheddar, had lost most of its armor. It gave a small blurt of defeat and just turned and walked away. They would be cleaning the quickly hardening cheese out of the God Machine's gears for months, so they decided they'd better get started right away. Screw the Fabricator General. He could de-gunk himself if he wanted these heretics that badly. The cheese kept the last Warhound in place, until Weeb dispatched it with a Talon uppercut. As we had been clearing the field of the Titans, our team had been leaping one by one into the boiling puddle of cheese, where we could move freely without being seen. Well, she had been mystically expanding it to make sure we could all fit. Confidence was the last to join us, as she was still chewing on the Imperator's head. There was an ear-shattering crunch, and the Honey Badger Zord pulled its head back with a mouthful of Titan face. There was a large fish tank type thing at the back, but it broke and something, or someone, spilled out as the god machine went dark and lifeless. From the sparking wreckage within, a battered and bleeding, we thought, and cheesed fabricator general emerged and screamed, "Omnissiah, avenge us! Kill these heretics!" Then the honey badger swatted him into the distance, Team Rocket style. But she was too late. The ground began to shake once more, harder than it had when the Imperator came out. From within the labyrinthine mess of rocky tunnels came a shining metallic figure. It gave a mighty screech as blue energy served up its spine fins, before erupting in a flaming blue plasma breath aimed at the sky. We all recognized it. The Competence was the first to shout out, "It's a goddamn Mechagodzilla!" Actually, once we got over the shock, we noticed our magical senses screaming at us and took a better look, and realized it was much, much worse. It was the Void Dragon, or at least the shard of it the Emperor had defeated, put on Mars, and allowed to sneak its mental influences into the machine cult. Something about our magic and divine interference was making it operate according to Kaiju/Power Rangers logic, which was probably a good thing for us. Critical, still out of the cheese, saw the arrival of this monstrosity and decided to finish the last staggering Reaver. He twisted reality, made it cry uncle, and the cheese covering the Titan mixed with some fluid in it to become sentient goo, which proceeded to eat the Titan from the inside out, causing large chunks of it to explode as the dairy beast expanded. Well, it might have just been the spontaneous expansion of the bacteria in the cheese rather than any actual sentience, but the effect was basically the same. Don't worry, we made sure it wasn't actually intelligent, and we were incredibly careful to destroy every last bit of it with fire and magic. We're stupid, but we're not that stupid. Anyway, it and its crew became part of the cheese. It must have been weird from the perspective of the Void Dragon. Here were these mechanical creatures that it had no hand in making or influencing on its planet, in its galaxy, fucking with its tech priests, and they dove into a lake of boiling organic goo. Then there was a loud series of clanking, and out of the yellowish liquid arose a humanoid titan, much less ponderous and obviously violent than the titans it had inspired. As cheese poured off the thing, the Mage Megazord strode into the fray. It was an impressive figure. One leg was the cat, and the other was the red panda, allowing that guy to teleport us at will. The Schnauzer and the Honey Badger formed the arms, allowing a bite fist and a Bork ray. The praying mantis latched onto the back, its arms folding forward to serve as scything claws, while the other two Zords attached to the outside of them. Sort of like a more stabby White Falcon Zord, if you're old enough for that reference to land. And the platypus formed the head, its bill folding down to make a chest plate. The Void Dragon blinked for a moment, then in binary said, "A platypus Megazord?" From nowhere we could think of, except Bard, who firmly believed in the reality-warping power of silliness, the gigantic robot pulled a large fedora, sized to fit, and plopped it on our head. "Parry the Megazord!" Then we got a wave of confusion from the Void Dragon as it tried to figure out how in the hell it knew what a platypus or a Megazord was, and who the fuck is this Parry guy? It was our moment to strike. We were each commanding a different Zord/limb, more like Voltron than the Power Rangers, so it took some coordination to even get walking down. Fortunately, the vessel had been made by a Gretchen engineer with orcish piloting in mind, so the buttons were all very simple, but the timing was still a bit much, and we were very clunky. On the plus side, kaiju and mech battles aren't exactly known for their nimble kung fu flips, so even lumbering around as we were still a bit faster than the Void Dragon. While it was still trying to figure out who was planting 38,000-year-old pop culture references in its head, and how, Bard fired off a Bork shot. The dragon staggered, but instead of stunning the creature as intended, it brought it back to the present, and the immediate issue of a giant humanoid mech, with talons poking out of its chest. It lashed its tail around in what was, given the aforementioned speed and size issues, a lightning attack. We all saw it coming, but we couldn't actually get anything up in time to deflect it. We stood there trading blows, in the best men in rubber suits and cardboard boxes tradition, before we noticed that the dragon was glowing. Specifically, its torso was emanating a pulsing blue light, which we all decided was probably unhealthy. That guy, being part dog, was distracted by the shiny light until we started getting hit by the absolute zero laser. Our armor started to freeze and crumble, and he quickly got his act together and teleported us away. The teleport was quick, which meant it was a bit unaimed. It got us out before we took more than minor damage, but we found ourselves knee-deep in liquid cheese. True, our Zords were cheese-proof, but even if we were moving through the cheese like it was water, standing knee-deep in a pool of water while you're trying to run around and fight someone is going to slow you down. Also, the Void Dragon was a lot faster, and frankly, smarter, than the Imperator Titan had been, so the game of teleporting behind it and shooting it while it turned wasn't going to work. It didn't take us too long to get to the edge of the cheese, but by then the Void Dragon had turned around. It aimed a hand, its fingers dropped down, and a barrage of missiles fired at us. Our shields were able to fend off most, but we still staggered a bit. So Welshie, thinking fast, ordered one of the arms to grab and throw the fedora, like Oddjob. Bard reached up, grabbed the hat, and hurled it straight at the Void Dragon. It was a beautiful throw, and if it had been a blade or something, would have decapitated the Catan. Or, if it had been a big metal thing like we expected, it at least would have smacked the bastard real good. Instead, it smashed into the Void Dragon, crumpled, and fell to the ground. And all of us, human and Star God, looked at it to see that it was, in fact, an extremely large felt hat. If that sounds ridiculous, I invite you to look up Big Tex at the Texas Fair, who wears real clothes. So it is a thing. Anyway, the Mechagodzilla Catan looked at the hat, then looked at us with a glare of pure, mechanized hatred for all of our illogical bullshittery. Which, fair. While this silliness was ongoing, Critical had a better idea. He drove his cat leg up, kicking a huge glob of cheese straight at the distracted Void Dragon. It hit the creature in the chest, splatting loudly but doing nothing more than cosmetic damage, and the monstrosity looked more insulted than anything. What it didn't know was that Critical was warping fate, allowing the cheese to soak into various crevices and cracks in the dragon's armor plating. Then, with the assistance of Weeb, they used life, entropy, and prime to give the cheese a very low form of sentience. And hunger. A mechanical dragon shouldn't be able to look terrified, as it feels its innards being gooed up, but it managed. Then we found out why we hadn't heard from Competence this whole fight. Well, actually, we'd been hearing her the whole time. It was just really heavy breathing that we all thought was some sort of static. Nope. It was our spirit mage, sitting in her Zord's cockpit, petting her new honey badger best friend, and imbibing its spirit of hatred for anything and everything that wasn't part of its immediate pack. Without any warning, or at least none that we were paying attention to, Competence unleashed a scream of fury and fired the honey badger rocket fist at the Void Dragon. We hadn't known our Megazord had one of those, but in retrospect it was obvious. All robots have rocket fists, at least when you've been showing your Gretchen engineer really cheesy anime. Anyway, this was special, because instead of a punch, the honey badger rocket fist closed the distance, its jaws opened, and it clamped down on the dragon's shoulder. As the Zord bit into the Mechagodzilla, from out of the open mouth hatch flew two figures, also launching themselves at the dragon. Competence and her badger buddy. They both landed with a thud and started trying to eat through the metal hull plating of the dragon. Which would have been ridiculous, except then Competence's spirit self, amplified by her magic and her barbarian rage, began chomping away at the Catan shard inside the draconic robot. It screamed. Well, squealed. I mean, what would you do if an ant bit you and you started to feel it take a chunk out of your soul? The poor Star God had a very confusing afternoon, and it wasn't getting any better. Between an enraged Competence eating her way in from the outside and the sentient cheese eating its way out from within, it wasn't long before the Void Dragon was just a pile of scrap. The rest of us sat in our Megazord, standing in the cheese, as the party's designated holder of the morality ball ate a Star God's soul. We could have tried to reason with her, or capture some of its essence, or at least put the poor bastard out of its misery, but all of those would have required getting closer, and that wasn't a risk we were willing to take until Competence had calmed down, or gotten full. After a while, the dragon collapsed in a jumble of parts and goo, and a few minutes later we saw Competence walk out, loudly declaring, "I'm your Omnissiah now," and pass out, drunk on power. Or maybe Catan are like turkey and just make you sleepy. Regardless, we took a few minutes to utterly sterilize the sentient cheeses and mystically ensure that not one drop could contaminate any innocent planets, or non-innocent ones for that matter. Then we made our way back to the hive, where our Zords were greeted by cheering hordes of workers and faithful, as well as slavering tech priests asking for schematics, and to know the genius who designed these. We didn't have the heart to tell him it was Whiny the Goblin, but we did promise to send along some more schematics if we got some. Competence had woke up feeling refreshed and not at all possessed by a star-eating malevolence as old as the galaxy. She swore. We did some magic to check, and yep, she was fine. She just kept insisting that anyone who looked even vaguely cogboyish refer to her as Omnissiah. She got a bit grumpy when they tried to demote her to Fabricator General. She'd gone to all the trouble of eating a god, after all. She deserved a title to reflect that. While these deliberations were going on, and the Mechanicus Forge worlds were getting long messages about the definition of dumbass, Bard had a thought. He wondered about the wanted posters, depicting all of our faces in the main plaza. Fortunately, we were all in our cogboy disguises, and to most of the AdMech, flesh bags all look alike. But it turns out it was a worthwhile question. Because, you see, the Imperial Palace, the High Lords of Terra, and the Captain General of the Custodes himself had issued death warrants for these rogue psychers, who, though they had been in the service of the Imperium once, had conspired with the creatures of the Warp, and were now on a demented quest to assassinate the Emperor. Once left alone, we went into a concerned huddle. All of that was true, more or less, but how the hell did they know that? Then, as we were starting to panic, we heard some snickering out of thin air. It quickly turned into deep, green guffaws. "Surprise! See, we knew you lot was headed to the Emperor, and so we thought we'd tell 'em you was coming, so you could have a good and proper scrap. You're welcome!" Thanks, Gork and Mork. Well, shit. End of episode 11. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Know it was a long time between the last two episodes. There was a lot of little parts to this. It was a lot of fun to do, a lot of randomness, definitely. This is the penultimate episode. Next one should be the grand finale as we invade Terra. We're already playing it as I record this, and we're having a lot of fun. One thing I will note, because somebody brought it up in the last video I posted for this series, they mentioned AI art for the thumbnails. I have been using it for this entire series, the Mage 40k stuff. I didn't mention it not out of a desire to hide things or to take credit for anything or anything like that. I honestly didn't think it mattered. Full disclosure, I do the premium thing because I like having audiobooks and it's worth it for me. So most of the time I don't even see the thumbnails, or I don't pay any real attention to them. I just put that there so that for people who are watching it, it's not just a blank page. If you look at the older Mage Storytime series, it's just the Mage cover with, some text. So I don't love the idea of using somebody else's art and then putting that as a background image or something. And for something that's just a hobby and for as little as I care about it, don't really feel like paying anybody for it. So I have been using AI thumbnails or images for the videos because most of my thought was it's about the voice and the story. And yeah, I, again, wasn't trying to deceive anybody. I viewed it as like half a step up from clip art and didn't think it mattered, so I didn't mention it. But yeah, full disclosure, that is what I'm doing, and hopefully that doesn't sour anybody too much. Also, on that note, the video for this, or the image for this one, my friends loved getting the Power Ranger Zords. Everybody died laughing when that came out, or when that happened. But I started playing with ChatGPT for the first time, getting it to make images for this, and the idea of a pink red panda Zord broke its tiny computer brain. So it was real interesting seeing both the cool things that AI can do and the very distinctive limits. As it'd be like, oh, this is a great picture, except you have one of these 6 figures wrong. Replace that one with this and keep everything the same. Okay, here's a completely screwed up picture with 5 different animals. Like, dumbass. But yeah, so lots of fun doing this one, lots of silliness. Oh, Weeb, who is, again, he and I are the two who know 40k the best. He nearly died when we finally picked up the long black lever with a square thing on the end, and he realized, son of a bitch, it's a toaster. And it was a fight not to tell everybody else. But once it happened, yeah, a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoyed this. I look forward, or I hope to see you in the next one. And yeah, thanks for listening. Take care.